She does not raise her voice. She has learned in 23 years of life that a raised voice only gives people permission to dismiss you. So she speaks in the silence she has created, and she makes every word count. 12 people are seated at the long table in the drawing room of Ashcroft Hall, and not one of them is breathing in any useful way. The candles have burned low enough that the wax is running in pale tracks down the silver holders, and nobody is thinking about candles. They are thinking about the letter, sitting now in the centre of the table, between the fruit nobody touched and the wine nobody wants, folded open so that anyone who cares to lean slightly forward can read exactly what it says. Standing at the opposite end of the table from her husband of 11 days, Eleanor Voss is wearing a steel blue gown that is too plain for this company. Her hands are at her sides, perfectly still. Her chin is lifted by perhaps 2 degrees more than is socially customary, and the effect is that she looks not like a woman who has done something reckless, but like a woman who has done something necessary and is prepared to live with it. The Duke of Ashcroft is watching her from the head of the table. James Elliston, 4th Duke, master of 3 estates and 2 parliamentary seats, is entirely still. The dinner guests have turned to look at his face, because everyone in this room has learned that the Duke's face tells you what a situation means. What his face is doing now is something none of them have seen before. Not anger, not contempt, something quieter and more unsettling than either. Something that looks, if you were being precise, like reckoning. Eleanor looks at him across 12 feet of polished mahogany and 12 years of other people's decisions about her life, and she waits. She is terrified, but the fear has been burning so long it has refined itself into something cleaner. She has nothing left to lose that she has not already calculated, and the calculation has set her free. What none of the dinner guests understand yet is what the letter actually says. They can see it bears the Duke's man of business's seal. They cannot yet read the specific clause, written in legal language designed to obscure uncomfortable things, that lists Eleanor Margaret Voss, unmarried daughter of the late Edmund Voss, as a transferable asset in a debt arrangement, as collateral, as a line in a ledger, to be settled at the creditor's discretion. She has known about this document for 3 days. She chose tonight, in front of these witnesses, to make it impossible for anyone to pretend they do not know it too. Before I take you back to where this began, if this is your first time in the Whispered Throne's drawing room, stay a while. We tell stories here about women who refused to disappear quietly, women who were precise when they were supposed to be decorative, and honest when they were supposed to be grateful. If that sounds like your kind of evening, subscribe. We will be here every week with a new fire and a new woman who will not be moved now. Let me take you back to where this began, to a cold morning in London, a debt that was not Eleanor's to carry, and the moment a Duke's solicitor knocked on the wrong woman's door. London in October of 1817 was doing the quiet work of recovering from a war it had won without quite understanding the cost. In the offices of solicitors and the ledgers of estate managers, England was renegotiating who owned what, who owed what, and what could be exchanged for what. Eleanor Voss lived in Cheapside, not by choice, by mathematics. Her father, Edmund Voss, had been the kind of man who was very pleasant to be around and very expensive to love. A gentleman of middling means and extravagant habits, he had borrowed against an estate that could not sustain the borrowing, and managed this so gracefully that almost no one understood the scale of it until he died in the spring of 1816, and left Eleanor with a house that was not hers, a debt she had not been told about, and a quarterly stipend released by an executor she had never met. Eleanor had one domestic companion, Mrs. Potts, 60 years old and partially deaf, who had stayed not because the wages were reliable, which they were not, but because she had served Eleanor's mother before Eleanor was born and considered the arrangement a matter of honor. The house itself was decent but not comfortable. The roof above the north bedroom had been leaking since March. The coal was an ongoing negotiation. Eleanor managed all of this the way she managed everything. Precisely, methodically, with the kind of unsentimental clarity that people sometimes mistake for coldness until they understand what it actually is, which is intelligence applied to survival. Every morning, without fail, she sat at the small desk in her father's library and wrote in a brown leather account book. Not a diary. Eleanor did not keep a diary. She kept a record: coal, 3 shillings, 6 pence, Mrs. Potts's cough worsening in damp weather. Roof above north bedroom leaking again. Must be addressed before spring or cost will compound. It was her way of insisting the world remain legible. When things went wrong, she added a line. She did not cry, she recorded. She was teaching herself to read legal documents with a borrowed copy of Blackstone's commentaries and a dictionary found behind her father's novels. She persisted because she did not look away from things that were uncomfortable to see. What she said she wanted was to be left alone, to manage what remained and live quietly. What she actually wanted was to matter, not to society, not to a husband, but to herself. She had a nearly mathematical gift for domestic economy, for the kind of complex household management that keeps large systems running, and no one had ever acknowledged this as something of value. She had a private dream. She would have died before calling it ambition, of running something. A school, an estate, something. She would not have said the word enterprise aloud, but she thought it sometimes in the early mornings when the numbers were right, and the thought felt like something true. What she feared was becoming her mother, a woman of great feeling and no agency, whose entire life had consisted of managing the consequences of her husband's decisions, until the consequences killed her. Eleanor had watched this happen. She had made herself a solitary promise at 16. She would not give everything she had to a life that did not belong to her. The problem, in October of 1817, was that the law did not especially care about promises a woman made to herself. James Elliston, the Duke of Ashcroft, was 31 years old and had been the 4th Duke since 19, when his father died and left him 3 estates and a formidable understanding of land management that James absorbed with the focused efficiency he applied to everything. He was, by every measure that could be measured, excellent at running Ashcroft. He had also learnt, somewhere along the way, to confuse management with living. He was not cruel. Cruelty requires emotional investment he seemed unable to locate in himself. He was controlled, methodical. He had proposed marriage to Eleanor through his solicitor, who communicated with her executor without any of this passing through Eleanor herself. He was 31, he required an heir, and the Voss debt had come through a consortium arrangement. There was a daughter, unmarried, without connections that would create complications. James looked at this the way he looked at a balance sheet. He said, "Arrange a proposal," through the executor. He did not ask Eleanor's name until his solicitor volunteered it. He repeated it once, Eleanor, and returned to the documents. He genuinely believed he was being reasonable. The first time they occupied the same room, it was a Wednesday morning in late October. He arrived at the Cheapside house unannounced with his secretary and a document case. He had come to inspect property forming part of the debt settlement. He had not come to meet Eleanor. Eleanor opened the drawing-room door herself, and James's first impression was not what he had anticipated. He had expected some form of anxious performance. Instead, Eleanor was holding the leather account book with her finger, still marking a page. The interruption appeared to be a minor administrative inconvenience. Her eyes, when they found his, did not move away. She was taking inventory of him, cataloguing him with precise, unsentimental attention, and the recognition of this was so unexpected that it took him a half-second longer than usual to begin the meeting. Eleanor noticed his hands first. The right palm had calluses, faint but real, the kind that come from actual physical work. She filed this. She noticed he introduced himself without social warmth, and that this was not rudeness, but simply how he was built. She noticed, with a discomfort she would not admit, that he was considerably more present in a room than she had imagined. It cost her something to notice this. She did not write it down. He asked to review the household accounts. Eleanor held out the account book. He opened it and read. His pace slowed. The entries were immaculate, sophisticated in a way entirely out of place in a household account book, annotated with dry, precise intelligence. He looked up. She had been watching him the entire time. "You did these yourself. Is there something incorrect?" He said no. He closed the book and handed it back, and then he looked at her. Not at the situation. Not at the asset. At her. It was a moment only, and then it was gone. But Eleanor had seen it, and she kept it. The wedding took place on the 11th of November. It was cold. The church smelled of old stone and tallow. Eleanor wore her second-best dress, and said the required words in the complicated way that a woman means things, when she has made a decision with her mind that her body has not yet agreed to. 3 days before, she had almost called it off. The final settlement documents from the executor arrived on a Thursday morning. Eleanor read through them methodically, addendum by addendum. In the third, buried in language dense enough that she had to read it 3 times, she found the clause. Her father had known. There was a specific clause in the debt instrument, signed by Edmund Voss in his own hand 4 years before his death, consenting to the transfer of guardianship and marital disposition of his unmarried daughter as part of the collateral arrangement. He had pledged her, specifically, by name, asset, one unmarried daughter to be disposed of at the creditor's discretion. Eleanor sat very still. She put both hands flat on the desk and breathed slowly, the way she had taught herself to breathe when something was too large to respond to immediately. She had been telling herself she was making a rational choice. The document removed that comfort entirely. She had not chosen. She had been disposed of by her father before she was ever asked, and every decision she had believed herself to be making had been the closing of an arrangement already settled before she knew it existed, and James had known. When she pressed the executor's representative, she confirmed it. His man of business had signed the acceptance. James had been shown everything. He had not protested. He had not sought her independent consent. Not because he was malicious. She was precise about this. Not because he was malicious, but because it had not occurred to him that administrative processing required anything more than administrative processing. She was a solution to a problem, and he had signed the documents. She was not yet real to him. That was the core of it. Eleanor took the document. She copied the relevant clause, in her own hand, into the back pages of the brown account book. And she began to think about what you do when the ground beneath you was never yours, and you have to build something anyway. The first weeks at Ashcroft Hall were an education in scale. The house was enormous in the way English country houses achieve enormous. Not flashy, but deep, room after room. James was often in London. Eleanor walked every room. She made notes. She reviewed the household accounts and found them adequate but not efficient. Managed by people keeping things running rather than thinking about how they could run better. On the 4th night of her marriage, alone while James attended to parliamentary business, Eleanor found the locked room. Working corridor by corridor with the steward's key register, she found the door the housekeeper had twice gently redirected her away from. Eleanor was not redirectable. She found the key listed under East Corridor, room 7, disused, and she opened the door. It had been Catherine's room, the first Duchess. Someone had dusted it periodically. The curtains were drawn. A writing desk held a pen stand and an inkwell that had dried 4 years ago. Beneath a small volume of poetry was a household account book. Eleanor sat down and opened it. Catherine's handwriting was warmer than hers, rounder, with occasional smudges. The accounts were less precise, but Catherine had been doing the same thing, tracking the household, writing down what she saw because it was the only way to insist that she was there to see it. At the back, in pages added in the final weeks of Catherine's life, the entries became letters addressed to James, never sent. Not bitter, that was what stopped Eleanor's breath slightly. Lonely, which is a different and in some ways harder thing. Catherine wrote about her husband who was kind when present and simply not present very often, about wanting to be known, not managed. The last entry was dated 7 days before she died. I wonder if he will notice I was here after I am gone. Eleanor closed the book. She sat for a moment in the dark with the dried inkwell, and the dust settled on everything that had once been a person's life. Then she replaced the book exactly as she had found it, went back to her own room, and opened her account book. East Corridor, Room 7, Catherine's household record, last entry, Spring 1813. She kept accounts. She wrote nothing else below that line. Some things do not need to be recorded to be understood. What had changed in Eleanor was not sympathy exactly. She was too precise for easy sympathy. What had changed was something more useful, curiosity. Catherine's letters offered a different account of James, not a worse man, a more broken one. A man who had done this before, who had married without seeing, and who was living with the consequence in a locked room he had been keeping for 4 years. He had learned the wrong lesson. He had lost someone and decided that closeness was the dangerous thing. So he had made himself safe by making himself absent. She did not become soft about this, but she became more interested in the problem. During the fortnight of guests 3 weeks into the marriage, she began to understand the full architecture of what she was dealing with. James returned from London with 3 couples in tow, 4 hours' notice to Eleanor. She managed it. At the first dinner, she was introduced to the other women as Ashcroft's new arrangement. A phrase delivered by Lady Fortescue with a smile calibrated to wound without leaving a mark. Eleanor responded with such precise social grace that Lady Fortescue found herself on the back foot for the remainder of the evening. James heard the phrase. He did not correct it. It was during the fortnight that Eleanor discovered she had no money. The quarterly funds from her father's estate that should have transferred on the marriage were absent. She wrote to the executor. The response came through James's man of business. All personal funds had been consolidated into the household budget, as was customary. She was welcome to apply to the Duke's secretary for personal expenditure requests. She did not have a shilling that was legally hers. Different ledger, same line. 3 weeks into the marriage, reviewing the estate papers at her own desk, Eleanor found the Yorkshire accounts. She stacked the Yorkshire estate reports in order and ran the actual mathematics behind the softened summaries, travelling from the steward to the main house for 2 years. The estate was in crisis. Crop failures, drainage failures, tenant defaults accumulating quietly. The steward, Mr. Hollis, was not corrupt. He was frightened. The reports had grown more optimistic as the situation grew more dire, which is the particular mathematics of institutional fear. The estate was 18 months from generating net losses. Within 3 years, the Yorkshire estate would need to be sold. And in James's private study, in a framed letter from his father that Eleanor had read during her household inventory, "Do not sell it. It is not ours. It belongs to the families who work it." The strategic play was obvious. She had information James needed. She could use it as leverage to force acknowledgement, to extract standing. 6 weeks ago she would have made that play, but she had read Catherine's letters, and Eleanor made a decision she could not have articulated cleanly if pressed. She was not going to prove she was clever. She was going to prove she was someone worth knowing. These were different things, and only one of them could change what was between them. She sent James a letter informing him she was going to Yorkshire. Not asking, informing. She spent 2 days at the estate, walking the drainage ditches, meeting tenant families by name, speaking with the vicar and a drainage surveyor. She returned with 12 pages of notes and a clear picture of exactly what needed to happen and in what order. She asked the secretary, on 3 consecutive days, for an appointment with the Duke. She was told he was occupied. He would see her tomorrow. The week was particularly full. On the 3rd evening, she knocked on the study door and opened it herself. You need to understand what Eleanor has decided before she speaks. She has been silent for 4 weeks, strategically patient, efficiently invisible in exactly the ways an Ashcroft Duchess is expected to be invisible. And it has cost her more than she has been willing to account for in the brown leather book. She has not written down what it feels like to live in a house that is legally hers and practically not hers, to hear herself called an arrangement, to sit for a portrait in a chair she was not asked to choose. Tonight she is done. James was at his desk when she opened the door. Papers everywhere, the lamp burning, the room smelling of ink and cold leather. He looked up and began to say that he would see her tomorrow, and Eleanor closed the door behind her and set the 12 pages of Yorkshire notes on the edge of his desk. He looked at the pages, he looked at her. You will find in those pages a complete account of the Yorkshire situation, she said. Yield deficits, tenant arrears, drainage failures, and a projection of losses across the next 24 months. You will also find 3 proposals for remediation, 2 of which require your direct involvement on site, and 1 of which can be managed from London if you prefer. I have spoken with the steward, with 4 tenant representatives, and with the local drainage surveyor. I have the endorsement of the vicar who knows the families. She paused. She did not look away. I am telling you this not because I wish something in return, not because I am negotiating. I am telling you because your father left you a letter in that frame, and in it he asked you to remember that the Yorkshire families are not a line in a ledger. I believe you have forgotten that. A pause. I do not think it is because you are a bad man. I think it is because you have been running your life the way you run your accounts, at a distance, efficiently, without ever getting close enough to see what is actually happening. The room was quiet. The lamp made its small, steady sound. I was on that list, Your Grace. Asset, 1 unmarried daughter, to be disposed of at the creditor's discretion. I have read the document. I imagine you have too. I have been a line in a ledger my entire life. My father put me there. Your man of business kept me there. And I have decided, quietly, without drama, in the way that I do everything, that I am finished with it. She did not move toward the door. She was not done. I am not asking you to love me. I am not asking you to pretend this marriage is something it is not. I am asking you to look at me when I enter a room. I am asking you to include me in the decisions that affect this household, because I am better at it than anyone currently managing it, and you know that. And I am asking you, just once, just now, to tell me whether my name is something you think about, or whether you have filed it under D for Duchess and moved on. Then she'd waited. She did not fill the silence. Some silences need to be felt rather than covered, and the impulse to speak into discomfort is almost always in service of the person who cannot bear to sit with it. She could bear to sit with it. She had been sitting with uncomfortable things her entire life. James looked at the 12 pages, not the way he looked at documents. He turned them slowly, one by one, reading the annotations in her hand. His pace slowed the same way it had slowed in the Cheapside drawing room 6 weeks ago. He reached the 3rd proposal, the drainage cost-benefit analysis in the margin, and he paused. Then he set the pages down. He took off his reading glasses and placed them on the desk and did not pick them up again. Eleanor, just her name, for the first time. In 4 weeks of marriage he had said the Duchess to the staff, and my wife in company, and you in private. And this was the first time he had said her name in a room with just the two of them in it. He knew, as he said it, that it was an admission. I did not read your father's instrument until after the wedding. She was still. I reviewed the financial elements before the proposal was sent. I did not read the full instrument. He stopped. He looked at a point on the desk that was not the papers and not his glasses. When I read it afterward, I told myself it was done, that there was no useful purpose in. He stopped again. He breathed. I have been doing that, telling myself things are done, that there is no useful purpose in looking at them again. The lamp made its sound. Outside, the house settled. It was not a decision about you. It was not that I made a decision and decided it was acceptable. It was that I failed to think of it as a decision at all. He chose the words carefully, and the care itself was something, because James Elliston was not a man who usually had to work for words. That is not a justification. I want to be clear that I know it is not a justification. Eleanor looked at the framed letter on the wall. His father's handwriting. Do not forget these are people. She looked at James Elliston, who had been so careful and so correct, and so entirely alone in this careful correctness for 12 years, and she thought, neither are you. She said, read the Yorkshire notes, all of them, and then tell me what you are going to do about the North Field drainage. He looked at her for a moment. Then I will go on Monday. He went on Monday, without his secretary, without his man of business, with only his steward and Eleanor's 12 pages, and he stayed 10 days. He walked the drainage ditches. He met the tenant families by name. He sat in the Harrisons' kitchen. Eleanor had noted the Harrison drainage situation specifically, and drank bad tea while 6 children moved around the edges of the room, and he understood, for the first time in his adult life as a duke, that he had been administering his inheritance rather than inhabiting it. He wrote Eleanor 1 letter from Yorkshire, 3 pages, not about finances, but about the Harrisons and the North Field. It ended, "You were right about the North Field. You were right about most of it." He did not explain what most of it meant. He did not need to. The morning he left for Yorkshire, he had stopped at the steward's office and given one formally recorded instruction. Eleanor, Duchess of Ashcroft, was to have full access to all household and estate accounts. Her correspondence was to be received and dispatched without review. Her personal quarterly allowance, a figure James specified, and it was generous, was to be paid directly to her own account. She discovered this when the secretary delivered the amended arrangement with a formal bow. She read the document. She opened the brown account book and wrote, James, Yorkshire, 10 days. Administrative amendment. Quarterly allowance restored. All accounts. Access granted. Below the line, in the space where she had never written anything personal, she wrote 2 words. He went. James returned on a Thursday evening and went to the drawing room, where Eleanor was reading by the fire. He sat in the chair closest to hers and said, "Tell me about your father's estate, not the debt, the house, what it was like before." She looked at him. She looked for the strategy in the question and found none. This was someone asking to know something about a person. She closed her book. She told him. He listened. He did not take note. 3 months after the evening in the study, Eleanor stood before the Ashcroft estate managers at the annual accounts review. At James's invitation, extended formally and without explanation. And she presented a complete restructuring proposal for the Yorkshire drainage system, the tenant arrangement, and the household budget. She had reduced unnecessary expenditure by 14%, while improving conditions for the domestic staff. The estate managers received it with surprise, then questions, then something approaching respect. Miss Mister. Davenport, 30 years with the family, said afterward to the housekeeper, "She sees it all, doesn't she?" He meant it as a compliment. He was uncertain why he felt, saying it, that he was describing something he should have noticed sooner. James commissioned a new portrait. He told the painter the composition should show the Duchess at the estate desk, account book in hand, and himself standing beside her. Slightly behind, he specified precisely as someone who had arrived at a meeting already in progress. The painter executed it faithfully. When Lady Fortescue saw it at the winter gathering, she was silent for a moment and then said, "Ah, the portrait needed no explanation and received none." This was never really a story about a transaction. It was a story about what happens when someone who has been valued only for what she can provide, a name, a signature, a solution to someone else's problem, decides quietly and with full knowledge of the cost to value herself first. Eleanor Voss did not storm the gates. She did not weep dramatically or plead to be seen. She kept her account book. She ran her numbers. She noticed everything, including the precise moment when the man who had purchased her began, despite himself, to pay attention. And when she finally spoke the full truth, she did not raise her voice. She had learned, long ago, that a raised voice only gives people permission to dismiss you. If you have ever felt like a line in someone else's ledger, if you have ever had your worth calculated by people who had not bothered to learn your name, then you know why Eleanor's story matters. You came here tonight for a woman who refused to disappear. I hope we gave you one. If this is where you want to spend your evenings, with stories like this one every week, with women who are exact and honest and quietly formidable, then stay with us. Subscribe to Whispered Thrones wherever you are listening. We will be here. And if you do not subscribe, well, I shall have to note it in the account book. And Eleanor taught us, everything gets noted eventually. It is morning at Ashcroft Hall. The light is thin and cold and excellent. Eleanor is at the desk, in the small study she has claimed as her own. Not the grand ducal study, but a reading room that had no purpose and could therefore be given one. The brown account book is open. James appears in the doorway, dressed for the morning ride he takes most days now, the calluses on his hands darker than they were in October. He says nothing. He watches her work for a moment. Her pen pauses, briefly, and then resumes. He leaves. The door stays open. She did not raise her voice. She just waited until the room went quiet enough to hear her. "Good night,"